So if you're starting your freight broker business, this is a brand new business, you're just getting ready to get out of the gates, and you start thinking about an LLC. And I know what happens. We see everybody else with an LLC. We see the signs all of our lives. They say LLC on them. And that just means that we're official when we have an LLC. But for most of you, probably 90% of new freight brokers that are getting started in a freight broker business, to choose an LLC to start that business under could be a big mistake. So what I'll do for you today in this video is, number one, I'll show you what is an LLC. And then number two, what we're going to go into is the advantages of having an LLC. And then number three, what I'll share is why right now you probably don't need an LLC. And then number four, what we'll talk about is when you should consider an LLC. And then finally, number five, I'll share with you what I think you should consider as an option instead of an LLC. So if it's cool with you and you feel like you can get some value from the things that I just mentioned we're getting ready to discuss, let's go ahead and jump over into the video. So two big prefaces before we get started today. Number one, I am not a tax professional. I can only give you general advice based on my own experiences and what makes sense to me as a business person. And then number two, before you act on any of the information that I share with you today, it's always a good idea to consult your CPA or your tax professional first. So now, what is an LLC? Well, an LLC is just what it says it is. It's a limited liability company. Notice I did not say corporation, but company. It's established at the state level and it's not recognized by the federal government. What an LLC does is it gives the owner limited liability for the company's debts. Also, what it does is it provides a separation between you and your business. For example, I work for Alliance Logistics. I own Alliance Logistics, but I am not Alliance Logistics. Alliance Logistics, it's its own entity and I am branded, which comes into handy when lawsuits come into play. Because when lawsuits come into play, then you can sue the company, but you can't sue my personal assets because there's a veil between me and the business. So far, so good, right? But now here's what comes into play with this scenario. Because you have your own LLC and your LLC is its own separate entity, now the LLC has to file its own tax return. And the question that you have to answer is it more beneficial for you to have an LLC than it would be for you not to have an LLC and not to have to file an additional tax return? Because what comes with that additional tax return is very likely a CPA to file that return on your behalf. So does the expense outweigh the benefit of having an LLC? That is the question that you have to answer. Oftentimes with new freight brokers who are not making money just yet and who also may have a full-time job and cannot give their business their undivided attention. So your business is kind of like an afterthought. So you can't put the time into it. So it may not be in your best interest to have an LLC because the benefits of having an LLC are outweighed by the cost that come with that LLC. So now, since it seems as if starting a freight broker business as an LLC is not a one-size-fits-all, it's not for everybody, then what would be a better way of starting your freight broker business? What would be a more efficient way of getting started? Well, I think the easiest way to get started in a freight broker business is to start off as a sole proprietor. You're already a sole proprietor by default. You don't have to do anything to be a sole proprietor. Now, sometimes people think I got to go in and file a whole lot of paperwork. That's not the case. You have to do that for an LLC. Now, you don't get the same protections that you get within an LLC. An LLC provides you that limited liability. You don't have that with a sole proprietor. But now here's the thing. You have to ask yourself the question, do you really need that when you first get started? If you need it, then you might want to start it as an LLC. If you don't think that would be a need, then sole proprietor would definitely be a way that you would want to consider. Because let's look at it this way. As a sole proprietor, I can do some of the same things that I can do with my LLC. For example, I can go and set up a DBA, a doing business as name. So instead of getting paid in my personal name, I can now get paid in my business name. I can set up a business checking account. And the tax situation is relatively straightforward. Since you are a sole proprietorship, that means that you are known as a pass-through entity. And with a pass-through entity, that simply means that the business income minus the expenses equals the profits for that business. So now that we have profits, we have to report that somewhere. So that will pass through, that income, that profit would pass through to our personal taxes, and we will pay the tax on that money based on our income tax rate. And oh, by the way, usually I don't have to pay anything to get that sole proprietorship started. If I do have to pay something, it's a very minimal amount as compared to LLCs. And I don't have to pay anything to maintain it. So as you can see, making a decision about the entity you choose has a lot to do with the money that you make and the protections that you want. There are times when an LLC would be the best choice. For example, I started off my business as an LLC, but I knew coming into the business, it was what I would be doing. I knew that I was going to put everything that I had into this business in order to make it work, and I knew that I would be making at least $50,000 in my first year of business. And most importantly, I didn't have a job. You see, I quit my job before I ever started a freight broker business. So I didn't have the job competing with the business for my time. So the benefits of having an LLC far outweighed the cost. Okay, Brandon, I got you. All of that sounds good. It briefs well. But what happened to all of those mysterious tax savings that an LLC gets? I know you hear all of that stuff about these tax savings, but are there really tax savings just because you have an LLC? Not that I can see. I don't see a whole lot of tax savings just because you have an LLC, because with an LLC, you have to pay federal taxes, you have to pay state taxes, and you also have to pay something called self-employment tax, and that's at 15.3%. Now, if you take an S election, then the game changes. When you take an S election, what the IRS sees you now is as a corporation. It sees you as two people. And why is that significant? Because it sees you as an owner, and it also sees you as an employee of the business. So you can take pay in two different ways. You can take a distribution of shares as an owner, and you can also take a W-2 pay. If you take a distribution of shares, that means that you, as the one owner, you own all of the shares, so you get all of that pay. But here's the thing. On your distribution of shares pay, you don't have to pay that 15.3% self-employment tax. You'll pay the 15.3% only on the W-2 pay. So here's an example. Let's say you are an LLC without an S election. That means if you make $100,000 in profit, you have to pay 15.3% self-employment tax. $100,000 times 15.3% means that you would pay $15,300 in self-employment tax if you were just an LLC. Now let's say that you take an S election. You make the same amount of money, $100,000, but now you get to take your pay in two ways. You get to take distribution of shares pay, and you also get to take W-2 pay. So now, let's say you take $50,000 in distribution of shares pay and $50,000 in W-2 pay. Guess what? You only pay 15.3% on the W-2 amount that you get paid. So instead of paying $15,300 on $100,000, you would pay $7,650 on $50,000 because the 15.3% only has to be paid on the W-2 amount. So that's a huge advantage. So when we're talking about tax advantages, those advantages come into play when you start making money. And then when you take that S election, it really changes the game. So now that's really something to get excited about, but I don't want you to get too excited because I don't want you to overdo it. There's something called reasonable compensation. So you and I have to pay ourselves a reasonable amount of money. Because the IRS knows that because of this provision, people try and take advantage of this provision and go in and say, hey, I'm only going to pay myself a very small salary so I don't have to pay 15.3% on the bulk of my salary. So now the purpose of this video was to make sure that you saw that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not just about going out and saying, hey, I'm going to start an LLC because everybody else is doing that and that seems like it should be the right thing for me to do. It's a decision that you need to look at and look at it very carefully before you make that decision. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I certainly hope this information has been helpful. If you want to learn more about the freight broker business, I'll leave a free link in the description. It's my 5-video series titled How the Load Movement Process Works. It will give you a look into the freight broker business, show you exactly how it works. That way you're making a decision in the light instead of a decision in the dark. And then if you want to know more about how we start to form the conversation, what we say to shippers when we first start calling those shippers, I'll leave a free link right here. So until the next time, I wish you the very best in your life and business. See you at the top because the bottom is much too crowded.